And one thing I've learned, I think, is that the most important thing for anybody who wants to write anything is just to write it, first of all, to get it all down. And then you can shape it, sort of panel bash it, do the surgery on it that you need to.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of I Know This Guy, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of some of the most interesting people I know. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to I Know This Guy wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, my kids want me to say something about ringing a bell. What the hell's a bell? All right, Ian. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You know, I was talking to Marcelo Brodsky, and he's the person that referred us. And one of the things that we were talking about were interesting people. That's when your name was dropped. So I can't wait to get talking. I saw matter of fact, these all hit a nerve. And they've been, I guess you've received awards for a lot of your writing. But, you know, the one that gets me, because I love Jamaica. I've been there many times. I've been there when Bob Marley was buried. But what you've talked about here is the tales of modern Jamaica. And I'm very interested to hear that, because during the days of Bob Marley, the political corruption there was absolutely crazy. And he had a few attempts on his life. And then your book, Bonjour Blanc, A Journey Through Haiti. Can't wait to touch on that. So Ian, I'm really interested in your backstory. I want to know what made Ian Ian. Can we go through your backstory and tell us details? I just don't want a quick summary.
I think what made me want to write in the first place was the fact that I was a complete failure at school in everything. I mean, I was a dead loss and considered as such. One of my favorite school reports from my school in London in about 1969, this was what with bringing chickenpox into the school, the boy is thoroughly lazy and it shows in everything he does. I've still got this report. And of course, you know, when you're perceived as being somebody who's sort of falls short of the mark, who isn't really kind of an achiever at school, you really, in some ways, I think when you grow up later on, want to sort of show everybody, the adult world, that you have the mettle to achieve and can actually do something. And so for me, a kind of life raft was writing. And I found soon enough that once I was in my teens, that I had a kind of flair, if you like, sort of gift for writing. And that was recognized by a couple of very important teachers. And it was from there, really, I think, that the impulse to write began, and the fact that I was perceived as being a non-entity, an idiot, a sort of failure all around.
You know, it's interesting that you said that, because when I went through school, I had a teacher. It was a math teacher that was very, cut and dry. Norm, you're never going to make anything out of your life. And you know, it was, I kind of fell into what you were talking about. I was, not the greatest student until I had to go back, and I dropped out of school in 11th grade. And then I went back, and all of a sudden I took it seriously. But I had a teacher or two teachers that changed my life. And they took an interest. They saw that I had some talent in different areas, not in writing, but it's amazing if somebody can see a little bit of potential in you. And it goes from, you're never going to make anything out of your life, to, hey, you've got potential. So it's interesting to hear that you said that. So now you've got a couple of teachers that are interested in you. You pursue, did you go to university?
Yes, but only after it was decided by these two teachers, these inspirational teachers, who were kind of mavericks. They were slightly off-piste, not very conventional types. The sort of teachers you don't really find, I think, so much today in schools, because everything's a lot more standardized and rote and kind of conformist. But it began really this notion that I might be able to go to university when my parents went to the school for one of these awful teachers' parents association kind of meetings, which my parents dreaded always, because they were always hearing terrible things about me. And the teacher said, "Are you the parents of Ian Thomson?" And they were convinced when they came home that he was talking about another Ian Thomson. And so, because I never talked to my parents about anything that I did in my private life at school. And they still, I think to this day, are not quite certain that this was the real Ian Thomson that they'd got. But anyway, after that, then I took exams for Cambridge in the UK and got in there, and I read English literature there. They say read English literature at Cambridge or Oxford instead of study for some reason. But anyway, I read English literature there, yeah.
So you got into Cambridge, and this is after the first teachers just basically kind of rubbing you off, and then the two that took interest. That's incredible. It's interesting. We're kind of going down the same path because the two teachers that worked with me were totally unconventional. These were teachers that would not be allowed to be teachers today. They just went off a different path. Yeah. So far we're going down the same life.
So actually, I was going to say for both of you, what are some ways that those teachers influenced you or supported you? Or the difference between those teachers be, or what would the difference be between those teachers and, like Ian said, like conventional teachers today?
It's a good question. I mean, Norman, if I could start, I would say that one of these teachers who's still around, his name is Dr. Jan Piggott, what he did in the first class he had with us was to present us with the lyrics to this song called Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Oh, yeah.
None of us had heard of. Very few of us even knew who Bob Dylan was then. This was in, I think about 1978. Dylan was, of course, famous, and right, but all us teenagers never knew much about him in the UK, so for some reason. Anyway, he gave us these lyrics and then cranked up the actual song on some speakers he'd brought into the classroom. So the walls were sort of shaking and we were sort of levitating out of our seats. We'd never heard anything like this before. And for me, that was a crucial moment. Not only did it show me that pop or rock music could have lyrics that were up there with Keats and Shelley, but also that there were different ways of teaching, and this was one of them, absolutely. And I still, with my students at the University of East Anglia today, I still play them Subterranean Homesick Blues first time round as a sort of homage to this teacher.
Yeah, for my side, it was, and this is kind of crazy because Mom, Hayden, can't ever believe that, this happened. But when I went back to school, the teacher, two of them the first saw my writings. I was kind of into the avant-garde. Anyways, the guy's name was Jim Majors. He loved it. He loved what I was writing. He loved the direction I was going on. He introduced the book. Actually, outside of the school, he actually had a psychologist or psychiatrist look at it because it was kind of dark. But anyways, I was older and we could go out for a beer together because I dropped out. I came back. And just hearing that, you're and also with poems, like writing poetry.
You were writing poetry?
Yeah. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And for our listeners, this is a first.
Yeah. I got some of the stuff still here.
No, I gotta see it.
I kept some of it. But anyways, yeah, he was great. He just kept pushing me to do stuff that, hey, before this, I don't want to say lazy, but kind of just jockish, go in the back, have some smokes, skip. But now I was really into his classes, and he would break it down just the way that he would talk and, show us or talk to us about English. I just kind of got hooked. Then the other one, he was an art teacher, and I really got into art. I got into surrealism, and he kept trying to push the limits. But what he got me involved with was animation and film. And so he would help me after schools develop these. At the time, every piece of animation was, done by hand. He would come over to my house and help out. And then we started entering into film, film festivals. Because of this, I ended up going to the best film college in Canada. Yeah, I would never have gone down that path.
Yes, and these are maverick figures you're talking about to a certain extent. Yeah. I think we need them still, really.
Yeah, and they actually came to my wedding. Anyways, right now, those two people would have lost their job. First of all, because we went out for a beer, but so then but just the type of the way that they conducted their class. They had full class participation. It was pretty much, you could say what you want. And that was unheard of. I don't know. You were just completely relaxed. You weren't kind of talked down to. Anyways, yeah, I don't want to take, this is your podcast, Ian, but it's just kind of interesting that we went down that same path. Now, it did not lead me to Cambridge. I want to talk a bit more about that. How was that experience?
Well, this was 1981 when I went up to Cambridge. And at that time, the college I was at, because the university is made up of lots of individual colleges, was all male. So it was a very strange environment. Today, it's coeducational, thank goodness. But in those days, it was only guys. And I remember there was a freshers disco, and they played at this freshers disco a very inappropriate to me song, which was the Talking Heads' Psycho Killer, which was played on all the airwaves at the time. So I have that strange memory of this rather kind of confined and retrogressive, slightly backward-looking, fossilized institution, this college called Pembroke at Cambridge. And I think for the first year, pretty deluded because the teaching there just wasn't up to the scratch of the teaching I'd had at school with these maverick two teachers I mentioned. And it was only after I started studying American literature there, I think, that things began to open up for me. But the first year was kind of a write-off. I just spent a lot of time going to parties and drinking, which was fun, but I didn't do any studying. Now, as I say, it's changed a lot, and Pembroke College is co-education, but it wasn't then.
Isn't that incredible? Well, we're not talking 100 years ago. We're talking 1980.
Yeah, and I was there for 3 years, and I left in 1983. And, a degree in English literature in those days was a sort of shortcut to, as what we call in the UK, the dole, social security. It wasn't really much help in looking for work afterwards, a degree in English literature. So after that, I did a diploma in teaching English as a foreign language. And I ended up in Rome, where I lived for nearly 2 years. And that was quite an eye-opener for me.
Culture shock. How was Rome compared to Cambridge?
Well, very different. I had no Italian, so I had to start from scratch. And I learned Italian the hard way, just picking it up off the street, watching television, listening to radio. And I left after a very mysterious head injury that I sustained in Rome, where I woke up in the flat which I was renting near Termini Station I was lying on the kitchen floor, basically, with the flat door was left ajar. And my flatmate came home and found me lying in, it sounds very macabre, a pool of blood with, in best Hitchcock tradition, the telephone dangling off it for the receiver and handprints of blood all over the walls. I still, to this day, don't know what happened. But anyway, I was taken to the hospital called San Giovanni in Laterano, which is one of the big main state hospitals in Italy. And I was operated on for hematoma and a fractured skull. But one of the strange things that happened to me then was when I came to in the hospital, I didn't speak in my mother tongue, which is English, but in the language that I was learning at the time, which was Italian. And these quirks of language are not uncommon with brain injuries. When the brain remaps itself after some kind of trauma, you often get these strange sort of linguistic quirks. And years later, I found the surgeon who operated on me, whose name was Professore Milza, Professor Spleen, that means in Italian, Milza, strange name, Professor Spleen, and he remembered me well enough. And to my disappointment, he was not at all fazed or taken aback by what I described to him as a strange facility I suddenly had in spoken Italian. He just said to me, well, it's not the Berlitz method, but a blow to the head, which is what you sustained, can probably work wonders somewhere when it comes to learning a foreign language. But the police investigated the episode because there was some suggestion that someone had broken into the flat and hit me.
Wow.
But again, I have no idea what happened to me. All I can tell you is I started speaking Italian. And in the ward where I was recuperating in this hospital, which was all men, there were a lot of kids who'd been knocked off their Vespers and motorcycles, scooters, and they weren't wearing helmets because it wasn't obligatory then in Italy to wear them. Even though it is obligatory today, not everyone wears them. And there were just a lot of pretty severely traumatized people with bad head injuries there. But for me, that was an incredible turning point in my life. I was young, well, relatively young, in my early 20s, and everything knitted together and healed quite quickly. And in the summer, the ward in this hospital became so hot and stuffy that I implored the nurses if I could sit out or lie out in the corridor, and they did even better than that. They put my bed up on the roof of the hospital. So I had this incredible view of all Rome, San Giovanni,
Wow.
the Basilica of San Giovanni, with the sort of Baroque saints kind of standing there looking at me from across the way. But that was some kind of education. And Rome was an eye-opener for me. And ever since then, I've had this great, deep love of Italy and Italian culture.
I've got to ask you, did you have to learn English all over?
No, although it had become, after the operation, quite rusty. And some words that I was more fluent with, more familiar with, sort of dropped from my memory. It was very curious. And I had to sort of work at getting the language back in some ways. Another curious factor. But, there are lots of stories, like Lord Nelson had phantom limb syndrome, where his arm was blown off at, I think, the Battle of Trafalgar, was it? And he was convinced that he still had an arm, because when the brain remaps itself, it plays these sort of tricks on the system, on the nervous system. And so it was, I think, with me. It's like one of those stories you read in Oliver Sacks's books, the wife who mistook her husband for a hat, or whatever it was called.
Crazy. That's really crazy. So you just ended up in a pool of blood. You have no idea what happened. And even to this day, you don't remember anything about that event.
Well, I have moments of lucidity. And one of them is that the porter, the concierge in the flats, came in the ambulance with me and my then girlfriend, who was my flatmate, to the hospital. When I interviewed him many years later for an article I wrote for the London Review of Books, where I was trying to sort of establish what happened or what didn't happen, I found the same concierge living in this same block of flats. And this would have been 25 years later, quarter century later. And either he'd had a lapse of memory or what, I don't know, but he said he wasn't in the ambulance with me. And that spooked me out a little bit, I have to say.
Whoa.
But to add to this story, I don't know if you've seen a film called Don't Look Now by Nicholas Roeg. It's about a sort of haunting in Venice. It's a brilliant film, and it's sort of very spooky. What I found in this flat, wedged behind the chest of drawers, the wardrobe, in the entranceway of the flat where the phone was an X-ray of the previous occupant of this flat, who was also an English person, who had also had the self-same injury, a hematoma with fractured skull. That was deeply, deeply spooky. And after that, I left. I'd had enough of them. But that's all absolutely true.
A little bit more than a coincidence, I'd say.
It was, yeah. It was.
So, okay, I guess you left Rome after that, probably running. What ended up happening after that, after Rome?
After Rome, I sort of settled in London, where I was born, and sent out feelers in the world of publishing and journalism and writing. At university, I had written for a slightly counterculture-ish magazine called Broadsheets, and that sort of gave me the confidence to try other magazines and journals, newspapers in London, see if they'd want me. Most of them back rejection slips, but a few sort of gave me a chance to write something. And one of these great editors was a man called Alan Ross, a very key figure in my life and in the lives of lots of writers in the UK, actually. Alan Ross was the editor of London Magazine. It's a sort of journal, a monthly journal. And he said, well, would you like to review this for me? And it turned out to be something I didn't want to review at all. I had no interest in it. And it was a book about Beatrice Webb, who was the founder of the Fabian Society in the UK. So she was a left-leaning friend of Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, and was very kind of pro-Stalin, even when it was clear that Stalin was executing people on a sort of huge scale. So she was a slightly naive woman. And anyway, I was so keen to get this review right that I spent about a week in the local library mucking up, researching everything I could on the Fabians and on Beatrice Webb. And then this review was published in the London Magazine in about 1984. And I have to say that everything that I've written since then cannot equal the great excitement I felt then being in print for the first time. It was indescribably powerful and exciting. And Alan Ross, the editor of London Magazine, then took me on to write lots more pieces, which I did for him. And it kind of began there with Alan. And Alan was also a war poet. He'd been quite a gifted Second World War poet. And he was also a sports journalist for the Observer newspaper. He was a cricket correspondent for the Observer. So a kind of all-rounder, Renaissance man, who was for me a complete inspiration. And I kind of owe a lot to Alan, as I do to these two maverick teachers I mentioned earlier, Jan Piggott and Laurie Jagger, the two. And incidentally, both Jan Piggott and Laurie Jagger at this school in London, where I was in Dulwich in South London, had taught, you might know Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, turned into a film.
Yeah.
And he also taught an English writer called Graham Swift, and many others. So they were they had this gift of really bringing out the best in pupils, somehow. They had magic. They were kind of gifted in that way. And so after writing a lot for London Magazine, I started writing for the New Statesman, which is a weekly English sort of political and cultural journal, for the Spectator, which is the same, but more kind of right of centre, if you like, politically, than the New Statesman. And I wrote a lot for the Evening Standard, which is a daily newspaper in London, and for the Independent, Telegraph, just hacking and writing a lot with reviews. It was a bit of a sort of, I would write for anyone who was willing to pay. I'm a bit more choosy now. I think I can afford to. But then I would just write for anyone.
So at that point, you're writing for different papers, writing for anybody that would pay you. What got you to the next step, like writing novels?
Well, if any, I had written novels. Most of my books that I've written, I suppose, might be considered in parts sort of a blend of fiction and non-fiction, but on the whole, they're non-fiction, although I've written some short stories. But kind of what started me writing books, I think, was just a commission that kind of fell on my desk one day from the London publishing house Collins, and they wanted me just to write a travel guide to southern Italy. It was as simple as that. A pretty kind of humble sort of undertaking, not very ambitious as far as I was concerned. But, I did it and it became a book. And I'm still quite proud of it. It's a sort of humorous book in some ways. And I can say this for the first time now, probably, to anybody, because the editor who commissioned it will probably forgive me for saying this now. It was a long time ago, but I was so annoyed by the advance money I got for this book, which is tiny, that I invented an island and put it in the book, which doesn't exist. The island is off Sicily, which of course is itself an island, and it's called Palinurus. and it has a population of wild goat, I said, and maybe a few fishermen. And I just left it at that. To my delight, I saw, like a game of Chinese whispers, that this fake island was then picked up by another travel guide. I won't say who, and they published it as though it was, holy writ. I felt bad about this when I got a letter from what I would have judged as being quite an elderly couple, because the handwriting was quite sort of shaky, the calligraphy was rather uncertain, who said, "We've been looking for this island, but we can't find it anywhere. And we've asked and asked and asked, but there's no sign of it." So I felt bad then. And I said to them, well, it probably went under in a volcanic eruption, and there's no trace of it now. Anyway, slightly impish, cheeky thing I did with that book, A Guide to Southern Italy. And then, still in the 1980s, this is, when there was quite a lot of money sloshing around London publishing, unlike today. And one of the editors who worked for a publishing house called Hutchinson, which is today part of Random House, big kind of lumbering conglomerate, huge organization, had this particular interest in French culture, and in particular in French culture in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. And he'd said to me over one of these sort of rather boozy lunches that publishers used to have, well, why don't you go to Haiti and write about the island? And I thought, great, it's fantastic. And this same editor, whose name is Ewan Cameron, had been Graham Greene, the novelist Graham Greene's press officer in London during the 70s and the early 80s, I think. And as you may know, Graham Greene wrote a famous novel set in Haiti called The Comedians, which is a sort of political satire about the dictatorship under Francois Duvalier, Papa Doc, and later Baby Doc, Jean-Claude Duvalier. Anyway, so I went to Haiti and started to research the book, which is a sort of history book as much as anything else, a sort of history come adventure, I suppose. And a story I have about Haiti is that I was staying in this wonderful ramshackle hotel called the Hotel Olofsson, which you have to imagine something like a creation out of the Addams Family cartoons. It was sort of very rickety, ancient construction with wobbly overhead fans in the dining room and sort of collapsing grand pianos and everything creaky. Nothing worked. You had to take a spanner into the shower room to get the thing to work and things like that. And my girlfriend came out from England to see me. This would have been about 1989, 1990. And I proposed marriage to her in the hotel. And at the moment, I went down in traditional fashion on one knee, and had also, by the way, pre-ordered a bottle of champagne. So I was so certain I was going to be accepted. The moment I went through all this ridiculous rigmarole, there was an almighty burst of machine gun fire outside the hotel. And the maid came in with the bottle of champagne, very nonchalant and relaxed. And I asked her in some sort of terror, what's going on? And she said in French, je ne sais pas, I don't know, c'est notre coup d'état, it's another coup d'état, which indeed it was. The presidents were sort of coming off the conveyor belt with alarming. Anyway, I'm still married to Laura. So this hotel must be a good hotel. It's for me, it sort of has a lot of good sort of things attached to it. And when I came home to the UK, then I wrote the book, which became Bonjour Blanc.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Journey Through Haiti? Bonjour Blanc, a Journey Through Haiti.
Yes. Well, first of all, the title. Bonjour Blanc would translate kind of roughly as hello whitey or hello white guy. The thing about this is that it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, what religion is, where you come from, what your skin color is. If you're a foreigner in Jamaica, you're always hailed as Blanc. So you could be an African American, and obviously so by the clothes you wear or your accent, and you'd still be a Blanc. Bonjour Blanc, Blanc. It's just sort of the thing I heard the most frequently. So I decided to call the book that. It's in some ways a history of the great Black liberation leader, Toussaint Louverture, who was a Haitian former slave, who led the only successful slave revolt in human history. He kicked out the colonial French from the island, and it declared independence in 1804. And as I said, this was the only successful slave revolt in history. And Toussaint Louverture had managed to not only expel the colonial French, but also the British, who were interested in claiming this island as one of their own, to go with Jamaica, which was a British colonial island dependency. But Toussaint Louverture defeated the British redcoats who were sent out in the 18th century. And as far as I know, this is the first time in history that a white army has been defeated by a black general. And when Haiti declared independence in 1804, they said that anyone could stay on the island with the understanding that they would be ideologically black. So even though there was a contingency of white Polish fighters who had gone over with Napoleon troops and had defected and gone over to the insurgent slaves, they were to be considered black, not white. So for me, this was the first time in history that the word black had been used in an ideological sense, if you like. And so this is fascinating history. And I kind of foregrounded it in the book, very much so. So it's as much a history as it is a kind of an account of me going around the island, And in those days, I was pretty reckless, I have to say. I wouldn't do half the things then that I did today, I think. For example, just taking off without any contacts in the hills and just talking to anyone that I kind of crossed paths with, because I was always much more interested in talking to the ordinary people rather than representatives of the government on the other side of a desk who just give you some kind of conventional stock answer to a country's problems, and not the real kind of problems that you get from the ground. So it's a book that's very much constructed around the voices of ordinary people. And it's still in print, so books have a pretty short shelf life these days, unfortunately. But that one came out, I think, in 1992. And then it was republished in paperback edition not long ago with an introduction by a science fiction writer that some of you may have heard of in Canada, called J.G. Ballard, who wrote a book called Empire of the Sun, which was made into a film by Steven Spielberg. Right. Anyway, so J.G. Ballard wrote the introduction to the paperback. And it's still kind of in print, and it's still kind of consulted, I think, by people who are interested in going to that part of the West Indies.
I wish you were with me back in the 80s. This isn't Haiti. This is Jamaica. I went there by myself, and I was just sitting at a bar and just talking up with this American couple, doctor and a nurse. And they said, do you want to see Jamaica, or do you want to stay on the resort? I said, yeah, let's take off. So they rented a car. I kind of was the third wheel. And we ended up, I don't know how, but into the mountains at this village, basically a Rastafarian village. And we kind of just hung out for, it was only for the night, and the next day we took off. But it was just seeing what other people, okay, yeah, I can go have another, whatever we would be drinking back then, but let's just say a beer. But it's just not Jamaica. And I think from that day forward, I don't want to be that resort person. I always want to, be going out and not going with a tour guide, but just doing something completely different that's, not on the beaten path. But I got to tell you, Haiti in 1992, or when you were there, I wouldn't have done that. You must have. I don't know the best way to say this, but I definitely would be not walking the streets of Haiti. I would be afraid for my life.
Yes, I mean, what I often did was if I was going into an area that was kind of flammable, that there was political upheaval in, I would often go in with a local aid worker or a priest. Often the Catholic Jesuit priests were great work in the front line with poor Haitians, and I would go in with them as sort of protection, if you like. So I wasn't sort of blundering in quite sort of unthinkingly. I kind of had a sense of what was dangerous and what not dangerous. But it's interesting you talk about Jamaica in those terms, because I think that some of the most tourist-ridden parts of the island in Jamaica are paradoxically the most dangerous. You can go to your all-inclusive resort, but because those are places that are sort of fenced off from the local population, and often where only US dollars are used as currency, and where people are given this sort of fake kind of Jamaican experience, there's a lot of local resentment, understandably. And if you leave your hotel in one of these places, you're going into a much more dangerous place, I think, than you would be if you're going into a part of the island that had no tourism.
I got to tell you this story. So Montego Bay, back in the 80s, just being young and dumb, I ran out of money. And back then, you didn't have cell phones. I mean, even to contact the bank back home. So the Royal Bank in Canada, they had an office down in Jamaica, but they weren't communicating. I had to go to the bank. I was expecting a wire. I talked to them, and they loaned me $20, not knowing if I'd ever come back, so I can get a meal and get basically. I could either walk back to the resort, which was very dangerous, or get a taxi to take me there. But they actually gave me $20 just because they felt sorry for me. This young, dumb, Canadian that just absolutely run out of 100% of all their money.
Yeah, well, sounds like it's a classic Jamaican story to me.
Yeah. Let's also talk about. Now, I know this is years later, but you also wrote about the Dead Yard, Tales of Modern Jamaica. Let's get into that.
Okay, the Dead Yard. First of all, the title again. The Dead Yard is the term that Jamaicans have for a house that is transformed into the place where a wake takes place after someone's died. So you have a period of mourning, 9 nights usually of mourning, where the place becomes the Dead Yard. So just as a sort of an abstract title for the book, I thought it was quite sort of striking, really, to use it. And of course, I guess it has connotations of, if you like, an island which has stumbled after independence in the early 60s. When it detached from Great Britain and the Union Jack came down, Jamaica didn't kind of quite go it alone as it might have done fully. So it's still hanging on to the coattails of sort of, Mother Britain in a way. And for me, the hope for these kind of dependencies in the Commonwealth is really for them to detach definitively from the motherland, from Mrs. Queen's land, as England, as the UK is sometimes called. So the book, The Dead Yard, with that title, definitely had a sort of sense of a critique of the island. And indeed, it is that. And it's quite a dark book, I think. And, Jamaicans, like anybody else, are brilliant at disrespecting their own country, but they're not very keen on others doing it, understandably, from the outside, And that book had a very, very rocky publishing history. I was on a bus in London when I answered my mobile phone after the book had been published in the UK, and my editor for Faber and Faber, the London publishing house that published the book, said to me, "I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but your book is not going to be distributed in Jamaica." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "There's been some pressure put on by a certain family not to distribute the book." And this family, who I won't name, but they were white plantocratic Jamaicans living in this huge sort of neo-colonial house. And it seemed to me replicating or trying to the sort of gone with the wind style of sort of old slavery days. And I kind of satirized them and sent them up, and they weren't pleased. But this is a very, very powerful family indeed. And they were so powerful that they were able to put pressure on the island's soul book distributor, a company called Novelty Inc., which doesn't sort of inspire great faith anymore. And so the book never appeared in Jamaica. But it started to accrue this kind of underground, sort of semi-stacked, sort of semi kind of legal reputation, something you might get under a counter in a shop, in a brown paper bag. And so it was being bought a lot through Amazon and other online sort of shops like that. And of course, if you ban a book, it becomes paradoxically perhaps a lot more popular, which is what happened with The Dead Yard. It's a sort of complement, if you like, to Bonjour Blanc, the book I wrote on Haiti, because, of course, Jamaica and Haiti are next to each other on the map, but they couldn't be more different. So Jamaica is English-speaking, Protestant, British, whereas Haiti is Roman Catholic, French, and 90% Vaudouisant or Voodooist. So a lot of people will be Catholic in Haiti, but they'll also venerate African animist divinities in pantheon that we call voodoo. And one thing that I was interested in both Jamaica and Haiti was the prevalence of any former slave culture of animist religions. And you get them in Jamaica as well, but not to the extent that you do in Haiti. And I would have to say not with the same grace or beauty that you do in Haiti. So voodoo ceremony in Haiti can go on for hours and hours and hours, but they are choreographed with this sort of grace and beauty, and the drumming is astonishing. The polyrhythmic patterns that these young guys throw out, the tambouriers, the drummers. And I went to lots of voodoo ceremonies. And one thing I wanted to do in that book on Haiti was to kind of realign the idea we have in the West that voodoo is this sort of satanic cult of sticking pins in wax dolls and things. I mean, it's been satanized by Hollywood. It's nothing like that. It's a very respectful fusion of Catholicism and African animism. So a big part of the Haiti book was my attendance with anthropologists often of voodoo ceremonies.
Yeah, I guess that would probably get under your skin when you go over there and you see what voodoo is, and then how it's portrayed with the little pins and dolls and everything else. And I see that with Hollywood all the time. We were just talking about this movie and going, none of this is correct. This is all some directors or script writers made up thoughts. And unfortunately, the people that are going to watch this are actually going to think that this is real. Anyways, he just touched on that, kind of touched on a nerve that gets to me too, because if somebody says based on a true story, yeah, maybe, part of it is based on, but it doesn't show the real story.
Absolutely. And one of the big offenders of that in terms of Haitian culture is the James Bond movie Live and Let Die, with Roger Moore starring as James Bond. And the novel itself, Live and Let Die by Ian Fleming, gives this extraordinary picture of voodoo as this kind of black art sort of semi-Masonic cult that is all to do with sort of bloodletting and sticking pins in dolls. So it's not like that on the ground when you're out there at all.
And was there any issue with you attending because you were an outsider?
No, that's one of the things that was most peculiar to me. I would go to, often you would just follow the sound of the drumming in the countryside and just walk there. And a lot of the people would be in semi-states of possession and wouldn't be mindful of you. But I found, in spite of my obvious, outsider status, that nobody paid me any mind. And in fact, so long as I often made a point of turning up with a libation, an offering of rum, a bottle of rum, the voodoo priest or the hungan would take that courtesy and then pour some of the rum out of the 4 cardinal points of the compass in the temple. And then I would just be left alone. And so I never, ever had any trouble or people sort of moving in on me because I shouldn't be there or anything like that, for example. What did happen, though, was that in spite of your own rational self, your own Western sort of mindset, the drumming and the heat in the temple and the sort of perspiring bodies and the music conspired to bring you as a spectator to a state of not possession, but you were transfixed. So you entered into a kind of trance-like state where time kind of dissolved. So I could be in a honfu or voodoo temple for up to 2 or 3 hours, and it would seem like half an hour. So it seemed almost like a sort of strange miracle sometimes there, a religious miracle, actually.
Hayden, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, actually. Did you notice how the religion affected people in their day-to-day lives? Because obviously, with Catholicism or Christianity, people will follow the commandments, and that really informs their day-to-day life. Like, how did the animism and voodoo manifest in their day-to-day lives?
Yes, that's such an interesting question. For me, if you were poor, and 80% of Haitians are very poor, then just for one night at a voodoo ceremony, you could be taken out of yourself and you could become part of this extraordinary theatre where you could rise above these sort of dire economic straits that you might find you and your family in, and be transported to a world of ancestral Africa in a way, and you could forget yourself. I found that the Catholic priests from France and Canada, actually, a lot of them were really great, fascinating guys out there, were very respectful of voodoo and would sometimes incorporate animist drum rhythms in the Catholic Mass, for example, whereas the American evangelical kind of born again sort of Christians and the Mormons in particular were very contemptuous of voodoo and would sometimes uproot the temples and destroy them, and they didn't ever live with the communities either, whereas the Catholic priests often did. But I think even if you were a very, very wealthy, sort of pale-skinned Haitian who'd been to school in Paris or the Sorbonne or something, you would have a maid in your house who would be of a different skin color, who would bring in the African animist religion into the house, inevitably. So it is all over the culture. It saturates every last sort of drop of Haitian culture. And some of the great Haitian artists have been voodoo priests, and some of the great musicians have been drummers that have kind of been brought up in families that have respected the rites and rituals of voodoo. So Haitians say that we're 100% Catholic, but 110% voodooist. That's what they say of themselves.
One of the interests I have, I love history, and just an interesting fact, and I hope these facts are correct, but I look back in the days, pirates, Captain Morgan. One of the interesting things I've heard about Jamaica, Port Royal, Kingston, Port Royal at the time, just prior to the earthquake, is that Port Royal was a multicultural city where pirates, privateers were, it was just a city of privateers. But one thing that Captain Morgan, who led these privateers, did not believe in was slavery. So while Port Royal, prior to the earthquake, was alive and well, there was no slavery in Jamaica. After the major earthquake that happened and wiped out, for the most part, most of Port Royal, then slavery was brought to the island because the pirateers were no longer there. I think that was amazing. I would have thought for sure that, and it was Captain Morgan, actually, that from what I've heard, probably one of the most famous people in Port Royal, but he was the one that stood out and just absolutely was against any form of slavery on Jamaica.
Yes, I mean, there are all these, British history is littered with these very interesting people who were dead set against slavery. One of my personal heroes is the 18th century lexicographer and essayist and journalist, Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, who lived off Fleet Street in London in the 18th century. And he took on a freed Jamaican slave, Samuel Barber, as his own sort of, if you like, valet or sort of manservant. But he didn't abuse him at all. He treated him with utmost respect and gave all his money to him when he died. And so British history has these sort of exceptions, as you mentioned, Captain Morgan, and Dr. Johnson is another one. Exceptions that defy the norm, the norm being slavery then, unfortunately. And you're right, it actually was only after the English took over the island from the Spanish under Oliver Cromwell that it became this sort of massive slave mechanism for the transatlantic trafficking of not only slaves, human slaves, but all kinds of commodities, sugar, rum, gunpowder, you name it. But really, in some ways, I think slavery is almost axiomatic. It's almost a given that any society that has a history of slavery will be, in some ways, quite volatile and at times quite violent. And I think that the legacy of slavery in somewhere like Jamaica is just impossible to ignore, just as it is in Haiti. Anyway, these are all issues that younger people much younger than me, are very exercised by now because of Black Lives Matter movement. Cool.
So let's talk about your novel, Kingston Noir.
Ah, yes. Well, that's a novella, I think. I'm very flattered you should call it a novel, but it's not quite as long as that. And it's more like midway between a novella and a short story, if you like. But the history behind that is I was asked by a Jamaican writer called Colin Tanner, who's a very good novelist, if I would write a short story for this collection called Kingston Noir. And those are supposed, as you can guess from the title, to be stories that had a kind of dark sort of edge to them, but were often to do with some sort of crime, as in the Hollywood noir films of the 40s and 50s. And I had an idea for this short story. I'm not terribly proud of it now, but anyway, I'll tell you about it. I got a very, very bad review for this Jamaican book in a New York newspaper. I won't tell you who wrote the review or which paper it was. But I thought, it's strange, as a writer, it's really only the bad reviews you remember, not the good ones. I've heard a lot of writers about this, and I think it's true. But the way I exorcised this bad review was to have someone with a name in the short story that was very similar to the critic for this New York newspaper, just like a homonymous near miss to his name. So it was almost his name, but not quite. This guy goes out to Kingston, the capital of Jamaica, and dies in a hotel in Kingston while seeing a prostitute. And his son comes out to the island to repatriate the body to America. So I had killed off the critic in this short story in a way. I'm not sure the critic ever found out about it. But anyway, I think writers often look for strange, sometimes quite disturbed ways, to be honest, of sort of laying to rest some sort of bad spirit. And this was such a bad review, that it left me reeling. And actually, after writing the short story, everything lifted. It was a cathartic gesture on my part, and the bad feeling went away. So in this short story, the critic, not the critic, gets killed. And that's what you do. You kill off your critics somehow in fiction.
That's great. Oh my gosh. I hope I hope this goes really well, because I don't want to be written off in one of your books.
Oh, no. Far from it. Far from it. I've done it once, and I've got the book. Again, I'm not sure if I do it.
Oh my gosh. Let's talk about, out of everything you've written, what's been your favorite and why?
Well, I suppose we've been talking about these areas of the world, the West Indies, which for me have their enduring fascination, because for me they're a collision of African and European cultures, if you like. And they were modern. A place like Jamaica was modern before the United Kingdom was modern, in the sense that intermarriage was already happening in Jamaica long before it was happening in the UK. So the sort of idea of the multicultural society made up of indentured laborers originally from China, from Asia, from India, from Africa, all kind of rubbing along together on this island, in this collision of sort of provincial and the local, if you like, and the European and the African, made these places incredibly fascinating for me and very modern. But I suppose the book that I'm the most proud of, in that it took the longest to write, and it's got nothing to do with what we've been talking about up until this point, is a biography of the Italian writer and chemist, Primo Levi, who I'm sure is known in Canada and is read there. Primo Levi was an Italian Jew, and he was arrested by the occupying forces in northern Italy, by the Nazi fascists, and deported to the death camp of a hybrid labor and death camp, I should say, of Auschwitz. And he survived and wrote this extraordinary book called If This Is a Man, which speaks to people of all religions and backgrounds. It's one of the essential kind of books of our time, I think. And after Primo Levi died in 1987, sadly by his own hand, so it was a suicide, a publisher asked me if I would write his biography, and I said no, because the death was too recent, and I felt that I wasn't equipped to write a book of this sort of gravity and of this seriousness. And then a few years later, another publishing house asked me if I'd write it, and I then agreed. But what happened is that I arrived in northern Italy, where Primo Levi lived, and most specifically in Turin, the city in the north of Italy where he spent most of his life, where he was born and where he died. And I had no contacts, didn't know who I was supposed to talk to. I just started to build up a kind of hit list of people that I thought had known or would have some kind of inside knowledge of Primo Levi, and telephoned them. This is in the days before mobile phones, don't forget. And in the very kind of primitive flat that I rented in the center of Turin, there was no phone. So I used to have to buy these Italian plastic phone cards and use them in the public call box in the main railway station in Turin. And I made hundreds and hundreds of phone calls this way. And I kept the plastic phone cards and put them in supermarket bags under my bed as sort of evidence of the amount of sort of research that I was doing, you know. And I collected these sort of great sort of bagfuls of spent plastic phone cards. And often the lines were down or the Italian connections were just rather faulty. And it was just hard work interviewing people. I interviewed about 300 people in Italian, because I speak Italian, and also in English in America, and with an interpreter in German. And what I had when I got to the end of the research was just a mass of tapes that I transcribed then. And I had no idea how to write a story out of this, because to write a good biography, you need to borrow techniques of fiction writing, and you need to have a beginning, a middle, and end. You need to have a sense of sort of pace. You need to have what publishers call a through drive, you know, a sort of narrative line that takes you through the book, or in the case of Primo Levi, his life, from the cradle to the crematorium, as it were. And it was very, very, very difficult to write, really difficult. And I got into quite sort of semi-panicky states about the sheer quantity of material I had. In the end, I cut 80,000 words from the manuscript, which is a lot, at the 11th hour, because I thought that they were impeding the progress, the narrative. And it was a particularly difficult publication for me because there was a rival biographer working on this book, on the same subject, who came out to Turin shortly after I started my interviews, my research there. But I knew she was in town, and I would think that I was seeing her on buses and trams. And I would see this weird doppelganger. Is it her? Is it not her? And then one day, one of my interviewees, somebody who had known Primo Levi, invited me. No, I think what happened is that I asked him if I could go back and re-interview him because I was unsure about certain facts, certain dates. And when I got to this guy's flat, the rival was there. Whether or not he'd impishly sort of double booked us in, this guy, I don't know. But I saw this rival. It was like a bad sort of Woody Allen film or something. And I said, are you, I'm not going to name her. And she said, yes. And are you the famous Ian Thomson? We shook hands sort of nervously. But this is an incredible publishing story, but it's true. Our two biographies were kind of neck and neck. And they were both about to come out with big major publishing houses. And I knew, and my rival knew, that if one of us was to publish slightly later than the other one, you would have to allow many years, and I'm talking about 4 or 5 or even 6 years to elapse before that book could be reviewed on its own, and there will be enough space between the one book and the other, because that's how publishing is. And so what happened is that these two publishing houses came to a sort of secret agreement behind our backs, behind my back and behind the back of the rival biographer, that these two books would come out at the same time, which is what happened. But I was sort of denied my solo flight because I was compared and contrasted with the other in all the national newspapers. And I knew then that only one of these books would survive, because in this sort of Darwinist struggle of books on our shelves, there's no room for two. And one would fall by the wayside. And because the woman who wrote the other book was older than me and was at that time more established, I was kind of convinced that it would be her book that would win out, if you like. I mean, it's horrible to talk about it in these times. That's how it was. This book that I wrote is still in print, and it turned out to be a happy story in the end, but a very, very painful publishing story to me. But I'm proud of the book when I look at it now, because somehow I did it. Somehow I wrote it. It was very, very tough. And I didn't think at the time that I could pull it off, that I had it in me. It was difficult.
I know this guy.
That concludes part 1 of our interview with Ian Thomson. Make sure to tune in later this week for the second half of the interview. As always, make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So if you want to see Dad's beard in all its glory, make sure you check in there. That's enough of me, and I'll see you next time.